we must constantly look at things in a different way.
The Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast was created by two physical therapists out of the desire to learn more about the different educational roles in physical therapy and healthcare, and how healthcare education works by talking with educational leaders and people with different perspectives within physical therapy and across interdisciplinary lines on how education can be improved to disrupt the status quo of healthcare education. This is our journey, and thanks for listening. Hey, everybody. Thank you for listening to the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, as we greatly appreciate your support to help us advance healthcare education. We are very happy to announce that we have created a new tool to help develop clinicians into better experts. With that being said, we have created the HET Light tool, which LIGHT stands for Learning Integrated Towards Expertise. And what we've done is we've taken our first year's worth of episodes with experts in the fields of healthcare and education, and we've taken one golden nugget or theory on expertise and presented it to you in a very easily consumable format so that people can take one lesson or nugget per week and map out and plan how to incorporate it into your clinical and educational practices. And by the end of the year, we think you'll be pleasantly surprised at how far you've progressed towards becoming an expert. To find out more, please check it out at pteducator.com/HET, which is also available in our show notes. Thank you again all for your continued support. And now for the show.
Hello, everybody. I am F. Scott Field, and as always, I'm here with my co-host, Brandon Pone. We're so thrilled to have on the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast today, Dr. Danny Matta. Dr. Danny Matta is a coach, physical therapist, educator, and founder of Athletes Potential. He's considered a world-renowned leader in the fields of rehab, sports medicine, and especially tactical athlete consulting and human performance optimization. He's also a fellow podcaster, hosting the PT Entrepreneur Podcast and the Doc and Jock Podcast. As founder of Athletes Potential, a physical therapy and performance optimization practice in Atlanta, Georgia, he's also one of only 8 instructors in the world for Mobility WOD Group, founded by Dr. Kelly Starrett, who subsequently will also be a guest on the show pretty soon. Danny received his doctorate of physical therapy from Baylor University. He's a board-certified orthopedic clinical specialist, certified strength and conditioning specialist. Danny also spent 7 years active duty in the U.S. Army as a physical therapist. He had the distinct privilege of working with a range of soldiers, from amputees learning how to walk again to the highest level special ops soldiers getting ready for deployments. Danny served with the 25th Infantry Division at Schofield Barracks, Hawaii from 2010 to 2013. He was the only direct access physical therapist responsible for management of injuries and injury prevention for a brigade of 4,000 soldiers during this time. Danny's been an instructor in a variety of different settings, from local consulting with CrossFit gyms and athletes to international teaching as an instructor for Mobility WOD. He most recently took over as the director of Mobility WOD Tactical, and is a direct consultant to numerous tactical organizations such as the FBI, SWAT, U.S. Army, and Combined Arms Group. Danny, first off, man, thank you so much for your service to our country, and thanks for coming on the show tonight. I know we kept your bio relatively brief, but is there anything else you'd like our audience to know about you that we didn't mention in the intro?
I think that was a pretty legit bio. My wife must have written that because it makes me sound a lot cooler than I am. It's been really. My career so far is relatively young, and it's been fun to have had an opportunity to be exposed to a lot of different settings, and in particular the military. That's been an area that I just think that PTs serve a really unique purpose there. Like, we talk about this idea of, hey, we want to have direct access in every state. I mean, you're talking about an organization that's had that since the 70s, the roles that you can fulfill as a PT in the military are really unique in many ways. So that was something that, I'm definitely really fortunate that I had the ability to serve in the military, but also in the role of being a medical provider as well.
Yeah, no, and we're so excited to kind of hear more about this perspective to how to really kind of connect with and teach and talk with these folks. And Danny, first, before we kind of get to a little bit of that topic, do you think you could tell us a little bit about kind of your academic journey and how it led to where you are today? Because I feel like your journey is a little different than many of our audience may be used to, having gone through Baylor's Army DPT program.
Sure, yeah. So my journey, at least to get to school in particular, is probably very similar to many other people, where, I had a knee injury playing football when I was in high school. I actually had to have surgery that after that season, and then went through physical therapy. And I remember going to physical therapy and not doing exercises that I was told to do, and then coming back, and the guy that I had that was PT, this is in Augusta, Georgia, he made me do assault bike sprints until I puked. And I thought to myself, I was like, this is pretty awesome, because he came up to me while I was yakking and he was like, "Are you going to do your homework?" And I said, I was like, "This is great. You can do this for a living. People pay you." So I thought, at 16, I was like, this is exactly what I want to do. And my dad was active duty, so he's retired Army as well. And so, it was sort of natural for me to think about going that direction when I found out about the Baylor program, which is just like probably the Army's greatest secret, and it's just such a cool program. And I know it is at this point, I think it's probably a little more well-known, and maybe a little more challenging to get into, but I was fortunate enough to get into it. And, so I went from undergrad straight into this doctoral program, and it's sort of it is accelerated. They spend a lot of time in clinical rotations, and I decided we had opportunity to do clinicals for a year, and you had a say over where you wanted to go. And I think you guys might. I'm almost positive. Do you guys have Andrew Bennett on this podcast already?
Yes, just recently.
Okay, so.
Yep, we did.
Perfect. All right. I thought so. So big shout out to Andrew Bennett. He was my clinical instructor for the year that I chose to do this rotation. And I picked New Braunfels, Texas, specifically based on a recommendation from an instructor we had, Deidre Tahan, who said, of all the people that we could go and work with from a manual therapy standpoint, Andrew is probably the best instructor. And I would definitely agree with that. The other thing about Andrew, I don't know how much you guys got into this for the podcast, I have to go back and listen to it, is he's also a very savvy businessman. And, I was fortunate that he gave me like business books while I was in this residency or internship for a year that he thought would improve my skill set, and was a very blunt instructor when it came to constructive feedback, which was fine with me. I respond pretty well to that. So, I think he sort of planted a seed in me of maybe other things outside of the military early on. I have a little interest in that. And then I went on to serve 4.5 years in the military in a couple of different roles, mainly, working with soldiers directly, and a lot of human performance work as well, which is really neat to be able to do a little bit of a couple of different things. And in Hawaii, that's where I ended up getting linked up with the Mobility WOD group, and I was stationed out there, and was offered the opportunity to come on to the Mobility WOD team, and primarily to really work with a lot of the tactical contracts that we kept getting offers for, where come in and work with this group of medics. And Kelly, I think, felt that I had a skill set that would transfer to being able to work with those groups and have a little bit more of an idea of how to speak their language and what those guys are looking for and unique problems to deal with. So decided to get out and open a practice, Athletes Potential, in Atlanta in 2014, and take that role with Mobility WOD, and really try to grow a practice here where we were really working with people the way I felt PTs should be able to work with folks one-on-one and really use our skill set. And then traveling, at this point internationally with Mobility WOD to really handle a lot of the tactical work and civilian consulting as well. But that's sort of the road that I've taken to where we are now. And I really think that a lot of the decisions I made were, I'm very fortunate that I got to be around some of the smarter people that I've ever worked with, in particular while I was in the military.
Yeah, Danny, that's an amazing story, man. I love that journey. Well, let's jump right into things and kind of dive into the specifics of today's show. But, it's the tactical athlete or the tactical patient. Could you kind of define for our audience what the tactical athlete or the tactical avatar looks like?
Yeah, I think it's a tough nut to crack, man. Because you got to say, like, oh, okay, so if we're talking sports specificity, if we're talking football players, right? Like, so we work with some high level football players here in Atlanta, and we know that that's an upright sport for the most part, right? Now they're going to hit the ground and they've got to be able to roll and things, but when they make contact or where they're changing direction, they're primarily upright in a lot of ways. So we know what they need to be good at. We We know what their domains of movement are and what that game looks like. Now, for a tactical athlete, you don't really have that because they sort of have to be able to do a little bit of everything, which makes it really challenging. I had a conversation once with a strength coach that was trying to lump them into a sport as best he could, and he felt lacrosse was the best fit because they're carrying something in front of them. They have to be strong. They have to be anaerobically conditioned, but also aerobically conditioned and coordinated and have accuracy. And I feel like that maybe was the best representation. But then, lacrosse players don't wear 60 pounds of gear and then be in austere conditions while they do their job. So you have to take these other stressors into what's going on. So it's a very, very challenging group to work with. And we know across the board, there's almost 1 million non-combat related musculoskeletal injuries per year in the DoD. So that's across the Department of Defense, which is billions and billions of dollars in healthcare costs, but also, days lost at work as well, and potentially even discharge from the military for medical purposes. So, it is a challenging group to work with. And I think that the area that we found the most success with, and this is really sort of just, Mobility WOD 101, is the idea that these guys really have no idea how to take care of their own body. And, that has to be an emphasis because they move a lot. They don't know where they're going to be in some cases. Medical resources are slim. And, if they understand how to manage some basic things that are going to pop up in themselves, then, we can really multiply that effect of medics and healthcare providers versus being very reactive. We can be very proactive and teach them how to, manage some of these issues before they're a problem.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good take, Danny. And I think just to kind of get some clarification here, so, in your opinion, what are some of the differences you find that you come across with educating the tactical athlete from, say, an everyday fitness-based individual?
Okay, so it depends, right? So tactical, I guess you could lump a lot of things into that. So it could be active, military, it could be law enforcement, it could be firefighters. And most of my experience is with active duty military. And not to sound negative in any way, this is just the way it is. Not everybody that joins the military is what you think of with the military. Like, not everybody is Pat Tillman, and when I joined, I was like, oh man, everybody's going to be super fit and motivated, and they're just going to want to train, and they're all going to be a bunch of badass American heroes. But the reality is, the military as a whole, in many cases, is a fairly unhealthy group of individuals compared to what you might think it is. Now, based on the general population, it's probably a lot more physically active because they have to train, 5 days a week. But there's definitely issues with weight management and, physical training. And you have to keep that in mind. Not only that, on average, you're dealing with like 20-year-old buttheads. So what they want to do is play Halo all night and drink Monster energy drinks and eat, honey buns for breakfast. And that's not necessarily something that leads to high level performance, right? So when we work with the conventional military groups, it's not necessarily going to be the level of knowledge that you would think. Now, when we get a chance to work with some of these special operations groups, these guys are fucking insane, and they're squared away, right? And they care about their body. They have an older average age. They have a very high knowledge level on how to take care of themselves, and they're very much interested in how they can maintain their body for longer. So, some of the challenges are buy-in, right? The idea of how do you convince a soldier that's 20 years old that thinks he's bulletproof that he needs to be doing some of these things from a preventative standpoint. And that is very challenging. And what we've found is typically they respond best to things that will cause them to have increased performance, right? So this is really across the board with any patient that you might have, but you have to figure out like what motivates that person. And if you can find that internal trigger of what that motivation is for that person, then you can typically make a stronger connection with them and get better buy-in, and also have a better they will think that you have the right solution for them, which honestly is half the battle. So for us, what we found is, if I used to go in, and like, this is when I was at my brigade, I realized this really quickly. If I went in and I did an injury prevention class about how to, not get shin splints or anterior knee pain when you run, nobody really paid attention. It was very poorly received. But if I did an injury prevention program, but I said this is a running performance clinic where I'm going to teach you how to cut a minute off of your 2-mile time, so you're going to get better PT scores and you'll get promoted better. Now all of a sudden I've got your attention. But they're one and the same. If you're an efficient runner, you're not going to get hurt, but you're also going to be faster. So this is something that's I think you just have to frame it correctly, and performance tends to drive change in a lot of these groups.
Yeah, Danny, that's a great point. It's really just how you package it, I think. And that goes, I think for the tactical athlete as well as normal everyday patients too, for sure. I kind of want to ask a hybrid question here that kind of involves some of your entrepreneurial background, but some of the tactical athlete stuff too. How important was building and utilizing your network in getting into a niche such as tactical athlete training and education?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was everything, right? But my relationship development with Kelly Starrett, who offered me this, opportunity, was really built from me wanting to progress as a physical therapist, and I had no desire whatsoever to get out of the Army. If you'd asked me, in 2013, at the beginning of 2013, I would have told you, I was going to be in it for a career, and that was the assumption I had when I went to the Baylor program. In many ways, I thought maybe, I'll do my career and then I'll get out and maybe I'll open a practice or something like that. But, when he reached out to me and gauged my interest in it, he said something to me that was really interesting, where he said, I feel like you can help the military more from the outside than being in it. And it makes a lot of sense because in the military, you're seen as your rank, right? So I'm Captain Matta when I show up to whatever I have to say, it doesn't really matter because I'm Captain Matta. And if Major whoever or Lieutenant Colonel whoever or General whoever disagrees with me or thinks there's a better way, then that is the direction that we're going to go. And it can be a bit of a frustrating group to work in. So, when he pitched it to me that way, it made actually a lot of sense, because now I could come in more of a consultant role and be able to have my message taken differently. And what's funny is, I can tell you, like, I still have a lot of connections in the military because I know a lot of people that are still active duty. And I taught recently up at Fort Bragg for the Airborne Corps up there, which is, basically is in charge of about 90,000 soldiers in the Army. And the commander of that was actually the first divisional commander or deputy commander, I should say, of the division that I was at. And this guy wanted nothing to do with me whenever I first showed up, because as a physical therapist showing up in an infantry brigade, they don't know what the hell you are. And they do want to know why they're having to give up an officer slot for a physical therapist. So it was sort of a tough position to put yourself in. This guy just so happens to have hurt himself running. So I got to see him for a knee issue. We're able to resolve that. Not only that, but help him run faster. And then from there, pretty much whatever I said was a go. We could do whatever I wanted. Well, this guy, he's now the commander of this division. So I show up and he shows up to give me a coin, which is typical. Typically when you do a job in a military, they'll give you a coin that represents their, whatever, the group that you worked with. So he shows up and he sees me standing there and he's like, wait a second, I know you, and I'm like, yes, sir, I remember you. He's a 2-star general now. But if I had shown up as Captain Matta, I never would have gotten in front of this entire group of 90,000, people that are decision makers. But if me showing up as a consultant for an outside group, now I get to represent my views and they're taken completely different. So I'm not Captain Matta, I show up and I'm Danny. I work for this group and this is what I have to say, take it or leave it. But it's totally different in terms of the ability to make decisions and relay information without rank necessarily blurring the line.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important message for our listeners to hear in terms of how one simple little change in different position with being a consultant can really have reap some really huge gains without having to go as sort of a traditional route. So I think that's a really important point to hear. And, Danny, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and kind of ask a follow-up question to kind of what you alluded to sort of at the beginning here, in which you kind of talked about the Baylor Army program and kind of how it was a big secret overall.
Yeah.
And, something that I'd kind of like just to kind of get some clarification on for perhaps our audience who isn't aware, do you think you kind of give us kind of a background of kind of how that program's structured and kind of how it's different from kind of the mainstream DPT program that you have commonly heard about?
Sure. So the Baylor program is It's the U.S. Army Baylor PT program, which is in San Antonio, Texas. So it's Baylor faculty, but half your faculty is active duty, typically lieutenant colonels and colonels that have their PhD in neuroscience or whatever their subspecialty is, biomechanics, whatever it is. And so it's run half through civilian faculty, half through active duty faculty, but you get commissioned as an officer in the Army. You go through officer basic course, which is a training program, sort of like watered down basic training, but primarily for medical officers. And you show up in like August, and you do training until through the end of the year, and you start school in January. The didactic portion is condensed, and then you end up spending about 14 months in clinical rotations. But for us, it was 1 8-week clinical rotation, and then basically a 12-month rotation, where what they want is when you graduate that you're able to assume a role in a clinic or on your own and be sufficient. And what they don't want is this learning period where you graduate and then you have to figure out how to be a physical therapist and functional. They wanted it to just be you rolled out of school and you were ready to go, because you could be going to any number of places and be isolated. You may be the only medical provider, only physical therapist there. So the other unique thing about this program is, number one, the government pays for your education. So I had no graduate student loans from the PT program. The other thing is you're commissioned as an officer, so you actually get paid to go to school, which is when I first looked at this program, I was like, this can't be right. Like this, there's got to be something. There has to be something wrong. Like, what's the catch? Because I was thinking, well, going in the Army would be cool. I was thinking about doing it anyway. And now I get to go to like a top 5 program. This would be awesome. And then they're going to pay me to go to school, and I don't have any student loans. Like, man, what a freaking sweet deal, and it really is. And if you have aspirations to go into the military, like, it is an absolute no brainer for you to go this direction. And the other thing is heavily manual therapy and orthopedics based. Like, I had no interest in pediatrics or geriatrics or anything outside of working with this type of population, and that's what you learn. So if you are interested more in like the neuro side of things or inpatient, it is not probably the best place for you to go, because you're just going to get heavy doses of how to use your hands, how to work with sports related injuries, and progress those to getting back to, functional enough to fight.
Yeah, Danny, you bring up a good point. What are some other opportunities once you graduate from that program that you could get into?
So there's actually quite a few. They have some like DSC programs where you can get secondary doctoral degrees from like West Point in sports medicine. So I believe that's a 12 or 18 month program where you actually get assigned to West Point and you work with their sports medicine teams and you do some research up there. You could do that. You can apply to get a PhD if you'd like to do that. So they're called long-term health education. So if you apply, and it depends on the year, which types of PhDs they're going to pay for, but the military will send you back to school for, I think it's a three-year deal where you're basically a civilian for 3 years going to school. And my faculty mentor at Baylor, Lieutenant Colonel Schaefer, he told me a funny story about when he was at I think he was at Kentucky, where he went and did his PhD in neuroscience. And when he told his neighbor, he met his neighbor and they had him for like a barbecue, and they were drinking a beer, and he was asking what he does, and he's like, oh, I'm a student, and the guy was wondering like, well, how do you pay for this house? Because it's like in a nice area and he's got kids, and he's like, well, the Army pays me to go to school. He's like, they do what? Like, he couldn't fathom that somebody would get paid to go to get a PhD and not have any loans. So, and that's an option that you have. Now there's a catch, right? The Army always, if they're going to do something for you, like, you owe them time. So that's how they tend to try to keep people that are good providers, in, and they want to incentivize them to do that. So if you want to go do a PhD program, cool, they'll pay for you to go and they'll pay you while you're in school, but you owe them X amount of years afterward to pay that off. So there's definitely some things like that.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful to kind of hear, especially to give some perspective for perhaps maybe a pre-PT who's looking to kind of find what's a good school for them, kind of based on some of those benefits, because I think that's really important to know. And Danny, kind of fast forward a little bit now. So we're saying an individual's kind of gone through the program, and or just any program in general, and they're looking to start treating maybe a population or a clinic or a setting that treats more people that we consider tactical athletes or those with perhaps more military background, what are some of the biggest tips or pieces of advice that you would give to a young clinician just starting out that may be interested in helping to train and treat these individuals?
Yeah. So I would say the number one thing that I learned being in this tactical environment as an active duty officer was the fact that you 100% have to lead from the front. You cannot go out and tell people to do one thing, and if they see you do something differently, you're just going to get ripped apart. Like if I told somebody like, look, man, like you're barely making your tape test, meaning you're too heavy for your height, and that means that the Army may potentially kick you out because of this if you don't start to meet these health standards. Put down the freaking Danish in the morning. Don't do it, man. And yet, if I go into the mess hall and I'm eating breakfast and I'm chowing down on a bunch of Danishes, and that guy walks by me, he's going to be like, "Oh, what the fuck, sir? You just told me not to eat this." Like, why are you doing that? Or if I tell somebody, "Hey, you need to be doing, training. This is what it should look like, and prioritize your physical fitness." And yet I'm not actually in shape myself. That's a really hard sell to somebody. So I think you have to lead from the front. You have to show people that you're willing to, to not be hypocritical. And that is the number one way that I've found to get buy-in with this type of community, because it's very similar to like a team environment, right? Like it's sort of hard to break into groups like that if you're not one of them. And, if you definitely don't look the part, or you don't act the part, or you're hypocritical, they will not listen to a thing you have to say.
Yeah, Danny, I think that's a really good piece of advice, and something that I just really kind of want to get your opinion on, because this is something that when I've kind of polled some of my friends that have served to kind of see what their opinions are, I've kind of gotten some mixed responses. So I'm really kind of curious to hear what your thoughts in this next question is. But how important is it that provider, whoever they're working with, also has any sort of military background? Like, is that something that you feel is absolutely essential for buy-in to listen, or does that depend on the person? Or I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are on that.
I think it helps. I mean, like I had no, I had no prior service experience whenever I joined, right? So I was direct commission. I have friends that were, infantry. They were enlisted in the infantry. That were in the program with me. We had people that were in the special forces that went back to PT school. They were in the Ranger Regiment that went back to PT school. If that is what somebody does, it's almost like an unfair advantage in terms of getting buy-in with soldiers. Like if you show up and you wear the schools that you've gone to on your uniform. So, imagine if you're a 19-year-old soldier and your physical therapist walks in and he has a special forces tab, the way that you perceive that, like that's a rare thing to see in many communities. And that means you've done some hard stuff and that you've been in some elite groups. So if you walk in with something like that, I mean, dude, you could tell them to do whatever you wanted and they'll do it in that community. Now, is it necessary? Not, I don't think so. I definitely was able to have success in that community without a previous history of being in the military, but it is very helpful though. I would say it's very helpful from a standpoint of knowing how to act. There's a lot of sort of like unwritten rules in the military, and it's hard to learn on the fly. Like you're learning how to be a medical provider. They barely teach you how to be an officer in the military. But when you get to some of these group settings, they don't know that, right? So you just walk around and you have your rank on, and they just assume that you're an infantry officer or whatever it might be, artillery, and you're a physical therapist. So if you're walking on the wrong side of somebody that has a higher rank than you, they're going to wonder why. You better have your uniform squared away. Otherwise, they're going to think that you look like an absolute slob, and it's going to show up really easily. So some of these little things, if your prior service, are just no brainers, and you do them habitually. So these are things you just have to learn, which is a little bit more challenging because you're also just trying to figure out how to do your job.
Yeah, that's amazing, Danny. That's actually a really interesting point. And speaking of that, how would you say that your experiences in the U.S. Army and working with the tactical athlete have kind of spilled over into your business and entrepreneurial side of things?
Well, I think it's been very helpful. So a couple of things happen whenever you join the military. So number one, you get leadership roles thrust upon you way earlier than you think you should, or maybe you could potentially handle them, and it's just because in some cases, and this is the next man up, right? Like my first boss, when I was in Schofield Barracks, she was, pregnant, and she had like very early labor, very unexpected. And I was the only other officer at the time in that clinic, and she was in charge of 3 clinics, and it was a total of about 35 people, or 25 people that she was in charge of. And before I knew it, we hadn't trained me on anything because we thought we had time, and she ends up with, being on bed rest in the hospital. And next thing I know, the next day I show up and I'm the director of all these clinics at this staff meeting, sitting with a bunch of colonels, and have no idea what the hell I'm doing. So sometimes you get leadership roles thrown at you before you think you're ready, and you end up having to learn things very quickly and improvise in some cases, and just figure things out. And they put a lot of they put a lot of emphasis on you being able to do that. So business is no different, man. Like, dude, business is a roller coaster. And if you may be having a great week, great month, something like that, and the next thing you know, something negative happens, but your ability to stay level-headed and adjust and lead people, when you learn how to do that from a very early stage in your career, because you had to, is very helpful. And I don't know if you can learn that from reading a book. I don't think you can learn that from a class in school. I think it is a thing. It's something you have to struggle with, and you have to gain confidence in your ability to do that. And that is one thing, for better or worse, the military will shove you into leadership positions and expect that you figure it out.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important message to hear for our audience to hear, especially. It kind of reminds me of the quote, without struggle, there is no strength. So I think that's a really, really important point. And, Danny, I'm going to back up a little bit and realize I probably should have asked this question more in the beginning, but I kind of just thought about this now. So, as a clinician right now, I don't see a very high percentage of people that have military service, but I do from time to time. And, an issue that I commonly come across in general is, and I realize this next question could open up a lot of discussion here, and I'm not trying to open up Pandora's box here, but something that I think is really important to discuss is kind of really dealing with kind of the after effects of, a conflict, and especially the PTSD. And for someone who perhaps hasn't been in that experience exactly, and who's maybe working with an individual, whether it be a client or even a family member for that matter, who is experiencing that, in your opinion, what's kind of the best way to go about that to help that individual? And
that's tough, man. I can definitely see that's a challenge for anybody to deal with. I mean, a lot of it has to do with the fact that you have to understand, like, sometimes the personality changes that develop. Like, a lot of times people that are dealing with post-traumatic, stress issues, they tend to be fairly short with people, agitated, easier. This happened to my brother. I remember I was in the Baylor program when my brother got back from Baghdad, and he's a emergency medicine, and he was there for 15 months and just saw like really, really incredible amount of trauma. And not only that, but it's a dangerous place. So your stress levels are higher, and things happen where even if you're in a hospital or a bigger base, like, you're still getting rocketed and mortared, and so you're constantly in this high level of stress state. And I remember when Sam came back, we went out to this Brazilian steakhouse because he was like, I've been eating shitty food for over a year, like, let's go somewhere good. And he was stationed in El Paso, so he flew back to El Paso and then flew into San Antonio, and I saw him probably within less than a week whenever he got back. So we take him to this Brazilian steakhouse, and he orders a drink, and the waiter just got the wrong drink. And under normal circumstances, he's not somebody to just like lash out at a waiter or waitress. And he just berated this guy about not getting him the right drink. And I was like, dude, what the hell's wrong with you? And I didn't realize that he had been affected that much. And it's something that definitely affected his personality. And I would say probably for a good solid year, it was like that. And if you have somebody that you're working with that's like that, I think you have to just be very aware of the fact that the they may have done things or seen things that you haven't. And also they may also be slightly irritated that they had to do those things and you didn't. And it depends how they're working through it. I mean, if it's really bad, I would recommend that they go and, talk to somebody and get some help. And there's plenty of places they can do that are resources for the military. But I think you have to be really patient with those people, and you have to really understand where they're coming from and try to have perspective on that. But it's very hard to have perspective on that if, you haven't necessarily had to deal with those things yourself. So it is challenge, man. I don't know really the best way to answer that.
No, I appreciate that response, because I think that's overall still very helpful. And I think that's definitely something that I'll keep in mind. And I hope our audience will as well, especially if they ever encounter an individual perhaps that's going through that, to kind of at least help them point them in the right direction, at least. Because even if we haven't had that kind of, point of view or that experience, I mean, at least if we can at least, treat them right with good care, understand where they're coming from. And when that individual feels ready, if they're open, kind of pointing them in direction of further resources, if that's something that perhaps the clinician using judgment is needed, and assuming that the patient is open with that. So I think overall that's a really good take. And, and Danny, of course, being a fellow podcaster, we would be remiss if we didn't ask this question, but how helpful do you feel that your podcasts have been, and how have you tried to utilize them to progress your career and your business?
Well, I think they've been incredibly helpful. We started the Doc and Jock podcast. My co-host, Joe Shimonik, and I did. It would have been about 3 years ago. We actually recently, beginning of this year, decided to put that project on hold, and primarily because the three of us, Johnny, who is our podcast producer, Joe, and myself, had all taken on other projects as well. Me starting a business podcast, Joe starting a weightlifting specific podcast, and Johnny starting a marketing company. And what we realized was like, man, we need to find some bandwidth somewhere. And, and that's a podcast that you talk about reach. This was a hard decision for us to make, primarily because we had such an audience that we developed. But when we look at what our goals are going forward, we felt like we could better serve people if we really isolated to the topics that we felt we had the best reach with. And, it's a tough decision to make, because at that point, we were anywhere between 40 to 50,000 downloads a month. And it's crazy when you look at the geographic effect of like how many countries people are actually listening to a podcast in. It's unbelievable. So I think the reach has been massive. And not only that, but like some of the people that I've had a chance to talk to are for free, and what it would cost for me for an hour of their time to do consulting with, is crazy. And not only that, but just being able to meet some really high level people that I have a conversation with. And then in many cases, we had a chance to connect with people and be able to reach out to them and see if there's other ways for us to, be helpful and interact with them. And that's been really cool, man. Just like be able to connect with people that are like-minded and learn from them. It's almost as if, it's a whole nother step in your education, right? Like the amount of information I learned just from the Doc and Jock podcast, having talked to all these different strength and conditioning specialists, like my ability to relate to higher level strength coaches now and talk on a level with them is so much better than it was before, just because we've spent so much time talking to really, really smart people. And in the business podcast, that has been really helpful for me in a number of ways. Number one, I find that information to be a missing link in many ways in our profession to really establish ourselves in a manner that is much more autonomous than in many cases we are right now. And I think you have to do that through entrepreneurship and people coming directly to see you. But it's funny when you start talking to people about things in your business and things that other people could do better. And a lot of the consulting calls we do in many ways, I end up solving problems that we've been dealing for a while just by listening to somebody else describe the way that they view something. So my business has actually improved dramatically just from me being able to delve into some of these topics with other people involved in, entrepreneurial ventures within physical therapy.
Yeah, Danny, you bring up so many good points there. I mean, Brandon and I both, when we started this podcast, it was because we didn't know which direction we wanted to head in education and healthcare. And we knew that we wanted to go one direction or another, but we weren't sure which one it was. And I think, like you said, the doors that have opened because of the podcasting and the people that we've gotten to talk to have shed so much light on educational issues that we kind of felt, were out there. It's been amazing and truly a learning experience for us. I mean, partially it's been selfish, right? I've wanted to learn more about this stuff, so I go and I talk to an expert about it. And, it's really been helpful for me to kind of really get some clarity on which direction I think I may want to head in the healthcare field, especially with regards to education. So I can definitely see how the problem solving and the learning that comes along with podcasting is just so beneficial.
Well, not just that, but I mean, think about, realistically, how much more reach you have with some of these people that you're able to talk to, and when we first started, we tell people we had a podcast. Like it wasn't really. I mean, they weren't as popular as they are now. Whenever we 3 years ago started with a Dog Talk podcast, we told people we had a podcast, and they're just like, "What? Some little hobby that you do on the side or something like that?" Or like, "No, we take this take a shit seriously now." And like now, when you tell people we have a podcast, it's like so much more of a accepted, way to develop content and put that content out. So I think it's growing significantly. I love the idea of being able to have a conversation with somebody that you would want to talk to anyway, and then put it out there for other people to learn from. Like, how awesome is that? How much are we able to accelerate other people's, progression in whatever topic it is that they want to learn? And if you don't listen to podcasts, I have no idea why you do that. There's so much you could learn. Like you're squandering opportunity to progress yourself every day in any sort of information that you might want to improve on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, voice is definitely becoming a hot trend nowadays, but I want to take it back to one of the older methods of learning. Danny, what are some of the books that you've read that you feel really made a difference either for you in either the healthcare clinician side of things or the business-minded side, either or?
I think that the number one book that I give people, I tend to just give books away a lot, is The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. And that book I probably reread that book every year at least once. And if you haven't read it, go read it. It's super short. Stephen Pressfield is the guy that wrote Legend of Bagger Vance and Gates of Fire, the movie that they based 300 on. Like he writes a lot of like kind of war fiction books, and in particular, but he wrote a series of books, Becoming Pro and the War of Art, which are about this idea of fighting procrastination and doing the work you need to do and dealing with the discomfort of some of the things you have to do in order to progress. So that book has just been really impactful on me. I also honestly feel like every physical therapist that goes to school should get the book How to Win Friends and Influence People. I mean, that the information in that book is still so relevant. And, this is something that was written, I believe, in the 40s. And it's still just so impactful if you think about how to engage with people. Really, really interesting. And one book that I've read recently that I thought was great was Shoe Dog. It was actually the Phil Knight story about how he started Nike. And if you're in business right now and you're listening to this and you're in that phase of struggle, what Seth Godin would call the dip, which is sort of this idea of like when you first start anything, you have this kind of excitement that builds and you have all this energy and you're really, really, gung ho on it. But eventually you hit a dip when reality sets in and then you have to do the work. And that's where things get tough and that's where people give up. And if you can get past that, you have an exponential increase in whatever it is you're trying to do. And that's when you get out of the dip. Well, if you read this book, Shoe Dog, and you feel like you're in the dip, you'll realize that Nike almost went out of business like dozens of times, and it's one of the biggest companies in the world. And it just, Phil Knight, the way he describes that is just so interesting. And I couldn't stop, digesting that book. So I would recommend, all of those. I definitely am going to sway more towards the kind of business side of things. I think you can learn as much as you want about physical therapy techniques, but the better you can get at working with people and understanding how to listen and actually deal with human beings, it makes the techniques that you learn less necessary. Not to say that you don't need to be a good practitioner. You definitely do. But the best practitioners I know are the ones that engage with people at a different level than superficial.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point, especially the fact that, clinical excellence is all great, but if we don't know how to market it, if we don't know how to understand that individual with a lot of things, it's really not going to hit its potential that it really could to really get the best benefit overall. So I definitely agree with you that there definitely does need to be a good amount of incorporation of that along with clinical excellence to kind of help overall get the best fight for the profession and a lot of other issues going forward. I think that's true.
Totally.
And Danny, kind of, and helpful. That was very helpful for all the books and such. And we'll post those links in the podcast show notes for anyone who's interested. They can kind of check it out on the links through Amazon here. But, Danny, we like to end each episode by asking all of our guests this final question. And the question is, if you could change one aspect of healthcare education, whether that be DPT or other healthcare provider related, which aspect would you change and how would you change it?
This is an interesting question. I guess it sort of relates to what we were just talking about, in terms of, things you can learn from books. And I really feel like if we as a profession were trained in sales training. Now, people will hear this and they're going to be like, sales training? What am I, cold calling people or selling a used car? No, man. Sales training is your ability to understand what problem somebody has and how to position a solution to that problem correctly. And we have a lot of really, really low cost, effective solutions to problems. And physical therapists typically sell like shit. They suck. They're no good at it. They don't understand how to actually engage with people in a way that is going to make them want to make that uncomfortable decision of doing what we do, which doesn't feel good. Like, we're in the business of not having instant gratification. It takes a long time to get what the response that you want. So, if our PT students understood how to sell themselves and engage with people on a different level, a better level, and I just call it sales training because that's the way that anybody else would teach it in any other industry. But if they understood how to sell themselves and sell a profession better, we would have so much more business and be able to really use our skill set, which if you look at the options that are out there, surgery, it's unnecessary procedures like injections or, some of these like minor procedures, minor surgeries they talk about. It's medicine that we know doesn't really do anything but harms us internally. It's nothing good versus, what we have is something that it has no side effects. It's positive. It's people learning how to take care of themselves. And, if we could be better at one thing, it would be understanding how to sell ourselves and sell solutions to problems to create people making changes and committing to making changes long term.
Yeah, I think that's a great take on it, Danny. I mean, at the end of the day, selling is really just helping people make better, well-informed decisions, and I think we need to, as therapists, get over that and realize that because it really is just we have so much time with our patients. That's one of the benefits that we have in this healthcare field. And, we need to be able to take that time and utilize it into making good relationships, using our knowledge to help educate people and really kind of get down to the fact that, hey, look, at the end of the day, physical therapy is a pretty good decision. It's a pretty good choice. At the very least, it's non-invasive, and
Totally, man. I 100% agree with you. And I like to think of it as like, we call it like assistant buyers. Like we tell our staff when we do sales training, which we do every month, we talk about this. It's like, dude, imagine you're in the room as an assistant buyer. Like you're trying to help them make the right decision. You're not trying to push them to anything. What you're trying to do is be an advocate for them to actually finally have talked to somebody in a transparent way in healthcare that has, we have a cash practice, right? So we have I don't care what the hell Aetna tells me they're going to reimburse me for. I could care less because we're going to do what's best for that patient at that time based on our clinical expertise and what we feel is relevant. And that's a nice place to be because I am now a fully transparent healthcare provider with you. I can't tell you that everybody you go to see is going to make those same decisions. I can't say if that surgeon you go to see is in debt up to his eyeballs because he has terrible spending habits, and that guy just has to do a couple more surgeries per month so he can meet his mortgage and send his kids to a private school they go to. I don't know, but that does exist, and we can't take any sort of healthcare provider and put them on a pedestal of like, ideally, that's the way it would work, where they would make decisions solely based on the best, interest of the patient. But, you and I both know that does not necessarily exist in all cases. So if that person doesn't make the right decision to where, we're able to help them, who knows what's going to happen to them down the line. And so we look at it as it's our way to help them as an assistant buyer and really be able to make a decision about what's going to be helpful for them, but also the least invasive, least costly way for them to get the solution that they want.
Yeah, great points, Danny. I can't thank you enough for your time and for coming on the show tonight. Could you tell our audience a little bit about where they can find you online and on social media?
Sure. Yeah. If your audience is interested in checking our practice out, it's called Athletes Potential. So you just athletespotential.com, or you could just look it up. You could just type Danny Matta into Google and you'll come up with a bunch of different things via Mobility WOD or Athletes Potential. If you're interested in the business podcast I have right now, it's called the PT Entrepreneur Podcast, which is on iTunes. It's also housed on a personal brand site I have, which is drdannymatta.com. It's spelled Matta as the last name. And, that's pretty much it. You can always hit me up on social media, Instagram. It's just Danny Matta PT. I try to get back to everybody, even my, personal emails, Danny@athletespotential.com. If you have a question for me, please reach out to me. I get back to everybody that does send me an email. I take a lot of pride in the fact that takes a long time, but I think if you're willing to reach out to me, then I'm definitely willing to take the time to respond to you and answer whatever questions you might have and see if we can help you in any way. It's fun to chat. It's always fun to be on the opposite side of the podcast instead of actually having to ask questions and and record. It's nice to just be able to tell you what you think.
Thank you for attending class today, and we hope that you learned something and gained value from the content.
If you'd like to schedule office hours with us, feel free to add us on Twitter @HET Podcast, on Instagram, HET Podcast, on Facebook, the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, and the homepage, healthcareeducationtransformationpodcast.com.
And for those of you following along in the syllabus, extra credit can be obtained by liking us, sharing us, and leaving a review.
Let's continue our journey up Mount Educational Success as lifelong learners.